Good evening. Good to be with you again this evening. If you have a Bible, be turning to James chapter 3 if you would. James chapter 3. James chapter 3. We'll read from there here in just a few moments. We've been at this study for a few months now, and I hope that it's been beneficial to you. I know it has been for me as I've revisited this book. It is so practical in so many ways as we continue to walk, as we continue to learn, as we continue to grow. And just by way of reminder, just to look at those things that we've already looked at, of course, in chapter 1 about trials, then temptations, that specific type of trial, and then receiving the word, which is really the last part of chapter 1 there, and then doing the word as we come to the end of chapter 1, moving into really the rest of the book. We're even going to talk about that this evening with chapter 3. But then not showing partiality, which is a specific type of doing of the word, and then true faith, which is the very end of chapter 2, which is famous to many. In chapter 3 and in verse 1, James says, "My brethren, let not many of you become teachers, knowing that we shall receive a stricter judgment." So here he has a warning to fellow brethren. And this really harkens back to what we've already read, what we've already studied in chapter 1, in verses 18 through 20 there, being brought forth by the word of truth, and then specifically verse 19 being swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath, and we noted that's really in relation to receiving the word here. So coming back to chapter 3 and in verse 1, "Let not many of you become teachers, because the tongue is an unruly evil," as James is going to say later, and we need to be very careful. We need to be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath. And just as we've been doing throughout our entire study, and we'll note this here in a moment as well, James is not just sporadically moving around, going from topic to topic. Okay, it's not as if we've just talked about faith and then all of a sudden we're talking about the tongue. There is this type of flow of thought that's bringing us through the entire book, and that is very much connected. So let's go ahead and read the text in its entirety, all of chapter 3. We're going to attempt to cover this evening, and I'll try to be as brief as I can in all of those things. But James chapter 3 and in verse 1. Again, we've already read, "My brethren, let not many of you become teachers, knowing that we shall receive a stricter judgment. For we all stumble in many things. If anyone does not stumble in word, he is a perfect man, able also to bridle the whole body. Indeed, we put bits in horses' mouths that they may obey us, and we turn their whole body. Look also at ships. Although they are so large and are driven by fierce winds, they are turned by a very small rudder wherever the pilot desires. Even so, the tongue is a little member and boasts great things. See how great a forest a little fire kindles. And the tongue is a fire, a world of iniquity. The tongue is so set among our members that it defiles the whole body and sets on fire the course of nature. And it is set on fire by hell. For every kind of beast and bird, of reptile and creature of the sea is tamed and has been tamed by mankind. But no man can tame the tongue. It is an unruly evil, full of deadly poison. With it we bless our God and Father, and with it we curse men, who have been made in the similitude of God. Out of the same mouth proceed blessing and cursing. My brethren, these things ought not to be so. Does a spring send forth fresh water and bitter from the same opening? Can a fig tree, my brethren, bear olives, or a grapevine bear figs? Thus no spring yields both salt water and fresh. Who is wise and understanding among you? Let him show by good conduct that his works are done in the meekness of wisdom. But if you have bitter envy and self-seeking in your hearts, do not boast and lie against the truth. This wisdom does not descend from above, but is earthly, sensual, demonic. For where envy and self-seeking exist, confusion and every evil thing are there. But the wisdom that is from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, willing to yield, full of mercy and good fruits, without partiality and without hypocrisy. Now the fruit of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. So James has quite a bit to say about the tongue here, and we're not going to have time really to dig into all of the different ways that he talks about it. We could probably spend a whole quarter talking about all of the ways in which the tongue can be used, whether that's for good or ill. I mentioned back in chapter 2, he's just talked about the works that we are to be involved in as Christians, as disciples. And the tongue is one of those ways in which we can show works, that we can show our fruits. And he's even going to mention that. We've already read that. James does say in this text, he uses very hyperbolic language that no one can tame the tongue. It's an unruly evil. No one is able to do this. But then you remember back in chapter 1 and in verse 26, if anyone among you thinks he is religious and does not bridle his tongue but deceives his own heart, this one's religion is useless. So James has some expectations that you ought to bridle your tongue. He's not saying this is impossible, but it is hard. And it's certainly hard and it's impossible without God in the picture. We must use God's wisdom. So first of all, disciples recognize that words have power. They have great power, again, for good things or evil things. And I already mentioned, again, he's mentioned the danger of the tongue a few times now. The word bridle that he uses back in chapter 1 and in verse 26, and then again here in chapter 3 and in verse 2. This is the only time that this word is used in all of the New Testament. And even when we go down to verse 3, we put bits in horses' mouths. So this is the noun form of that same word for bridle. So we could even say it's used 3 times, but in a different way. And, most of us understand and know what that looks like. This is just one example of that when we're looking at it. It's just a tiny little instrument, tiny little piece that you put in the horse's mouth in order to steer it, in order to guide it to where you want it to go. Otherwise, it's just going to wander off wherever it pleases. And there's all these other instruments, and this is a modern-day bridle. If you don't have the actual bridle in the mouth, and the rest of that might be a little effective, but it's not nearly as effective as if you have that bridle in the mouth. And so we, too, need to bridle the tongue. We need to keep a heavy hand on that. And a disciple, James says here, who says they are religious and yet does not bridle the tongue, says that he deceives himself. He deceives they deceive their own heart. Some of us ran into a gentleman not long ago at the Jacks just down the road here. This was a few weeks ago. And some of us were talking with him, and we were saying, yeah, we worship at North Bibb just down the road. We would love to have you. And, he went on into this kind of long explanation of, yeah, well, I'm a Christian, but I don't believe in all that church stuff. I believe you can be just as close to God while I'm out fishing or hunting and all that sort of stuff. You've probably heard that. And he would say all of that is man-made, the church aspect of it, religion, and those sorts of things. That was a very brief interaction. And I don't know what his background was in its entirety. I don't know what his experiences were. He may have gotten burned by some other groups that he's been a part of in the past. I'm just not sure. But James says here that there is a good type of religion, and we need to be working towards it. We need to be seeking after it. So maybe you even show up on Sundays for both services. You go to Bible class. You're there on Wednesdays. Go to gospel meetings. You read your Bible. All of those things. All those things are great, and we need to take note of that. But if you can't bridle the tongue, James says, you deceive yourself into thinking that you are a true disciple. Now this goes for anything, and we even talked about that this morning with Balaam. But here with the tongue, there are so many ways in which we can abuse the tongue, in which we can be misguided. So religion, whether it's good or bad, what's it doing? It is revealing what is in the heart. It's revealing our minds, whatever we desire most of all. There in Galatians chapter 6 and in verse 3, this will be the final verse on this particular point. For if anyone thinks himself to be something when he is nothing, he deceives himself. This sounds very similar to the language that James is using. And if you recall, this even goes back all the way into chapter 1, and this is a theme that we can draw all the way through chapter 5, really, of double-mindedness. One who says they are one thing, but in reality they are something else. And Paul says the same there in Galatians. So if left unchecked, the tongue makes a disciple's religion empty and useless. So we can utter blessings to God on a Sunday, but we can utter profanities on Monday. And if that's the case, our religion is useless. And this is why, going back to verse 1 of chapter 3, this is why the warning is given, I believe, so specifically to teachers. It matters a great deal what we teach. Teachers hold a lot of influence over what someone can come to learn, can come to do, and so we need to be very careful about what we teach. There are many here that have used the phrase, Brother Donald used it just this last Wednesday, I believe. Language like, if there's anything that I say amiss, if there's anything that I say that's not according to God's word, then you'd be my friend and check me on that. It's not that we have to say that every time, but we need to have that attitude of, if I say something, please bring that to my attention. And if you take the position of teaching, if you fill that role in some way, we don't need to take that position lightly in any way. Whether that's the little ones, whether that's all the way up to the teenagers or here in the auditorium class, there's effort that's put into every single one of those. Those of you that have taught, I know you know that to be true. So we need to take that as a position of responsibility, and also on the heels of what James has talked about in chapter 2, the beginning of chapter 2 with partiality, there is also a danger for pride, of puffing oneself up. This was exactly what the Pharisees fell into so many times, where they were in that position of power and authority, and they lorded over the ones that they taught. They said, "We know better. Who are you to teach us?" They used that language a few times. And so that is certainly not permissible. Going back to chapter, I think it's, chapter 1 and in verse 26, with useless, maybe your translation says worthless, the very last word there, one's religion is useless. That word is used a few other places. In Acts chapter 14 and in verse 15, it's in reference to idols. Vain things, useless things, worthless things, these idols. 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 17, Paul talks there about a faith that is worthless, that is useless, that is vain. It's empty if Christ is not raised. There's a version of this word that's also mentioned in Matthew chapter 15. And it's the and I don't know everything there is to know about Greek. I'm just telling you what I've found in studying. But this would be the adverb form of that word that's there in 1 in verse 26. And in Matthew 15, what's being referenced is Isaiah in Isaiah 29 and in verse 13. And it says there, in vain do they worship me. So their worship is empty. It's useless. They utter with their lips and they say they're doing these things and they honor me as God, but really it's nothing of substance. So really what we have here, what's being described, are two types of hearts. Two types of hearts. One that reflects that it wants to serve God, and one that reflects that it wants to serve self. You say you worship and honor God, but you're teaching the doctrines of men. This would be vain worship. This would be empty and useless. Another example of making a show of righteousness just for the sake of it, I mentioned it this morning there in 1 Corinthians 13 about someone who sells all they have to the poor, who sacrifices their body. It can be useless if you don't have love there, as Paul says. One final point here. Coming back to that which we teach, I get no indication here from James in all that he says, really throughout the whole book, but specifically here in chapter 3. I get no indication of him saying, as long as you believe Jesus, none of the rest of it matters. You know, we can differ on all these other topics, but as long as you just believe Jesus, we're good. We can have fellowship with whoever we want to. Jesus said it mattered. James says it matters too. And we need to take note of that. So disciples also recognize that the tongue is small but very deadly. James has spent the last section saying again that works are a showing of true faith. And now he again talks about words being a specific work that is very important. Thinking about our physical bodies, the tongue is very small in comparison with everything else. It's not the smallest, but it's one of the smaller elements of the body, and yet it can do so much. It can do a lot. And this is, again, a lie that the devil wants us to believe, that it doesn't, don't worry about it, it's such a small thing. It's not a big deal. Don't worry about what you say. Everybody does it. Be careful. Though it is so small, it can do great harm. And so words are very important. They are so important that, again, he warns those seeking to be teachers of the tongue. We go over to Hebrews chapter 5 and in verse 12, and the writer there gives a similar warning. For though by this time you ought to be teachers, you need someone to teach you again the first principles of the oracles of God. And you have come to need milk and not solid food. Now, I believe what James is talking about here is probably more in a public fashion of teaching. There are many ways in which we can be teachers. We all know this to be true. Whether that is in our classrooms here when we're here gathered together, whether that be in the home, if you're a parent, if you're a grandparent, and you have influence in that way, that's also a great teaching role. Whether you're in a restaurant, you're at the mechanic, you're in the grocery store, whatever it might be, there might be a teaching opportunity with someone that you come in contact with. And as James has already mentioned back there in chapter 1, since we are teaching, if we are teachers and we fill that role in some way, what do we need to be doing each day? Looking at the Word, looking at the perfect law of liberty as a mirror, and making sure that we're correcting what needs to be corrected, letting the Word teach us before we go and teach others. Then again, we're going to camp out here for a moment. James uses several word pictures to help us better visualize the power that the tongue has. And he does use several here, really, in verses 2 through 12. He's already mentioned the bridle in relation to the horse. He also mentions a rudder that would be on a ship. This is a relief. I think this is in a museum in Spain, a relief of the Battle of Actium around 31 AD. This would have been between, I think, Greece and Italy. That's where this sea battle would have taken place. But you can see there in the boxes that are highlighted, it's not like a rudder that we have today on our boats and ships, but it's really more like an oar. But still, it's a very small piece on that ship. And these were even very small warships. There were ones even larger than this. And it's able to go any direction the pilot desires. And it guides that great ship. He also likens the tongue to a great fire. Those of you who have been to the Smoky Mountains, you probably remember a few years ago in 2016 when the forest fires wiped out a lot of the mountains there and the landscapes. This is Mount LeConte before and after, and there's a lot of what they call the fire scars that are there on the mountains. And I think just now they're beginning to recover in their fullest form, and even still there's some places where vegetation won't grow. But James talks about here a fire, a world of iniquity. It sets on fire the course of nature, and then as a result, the whole body is defiled. And so we think about with the forest fire, and we see images on the news and other videos, and I think with this particular fire, I think they initially backed off of their verdict that the juveniles that were playing with matches, they did not prosecute them, even though they seemed to be a cause for it. But they caused the fire towards the chimney tops area. It did not take very long for that fire to spread. And it went even towards down towards Gatlinburg, the city itself. There was smoke damage through there. And we understand that just that little flame of a match, it doesn't take much, and a lot of damage can be done. Healing does take place, but that's going to take time too. And it's better to not set the flame at all. He also talks about taming animals, which is, again, very similar to the horse. And this, again, is kind of hyperbolic language of, every type of animal has been tamed. It's the idea that, man has tamed every type of animal, every kind of animal. Even these, like a horse, a hulking animal that's so huge that would seem like it's untamable, but it has been tamed. The tongue is much harder. It's much harder to do that. He also likens it to a fountain or a spring. This is a photo of the Roman baths in the United Kingdom. This dates back to 60 or 70 AD. And I believe these springs, these natural springs, this bath is fed by 3 natural springs. And it can only produce a certain type of water. Nothing else. James makes that point. It can't produce fresh and bitter water, he says. And then he also, in like manner here, he compares different types of plants that produce different types of fruits. So a fig tree cannot bear olives, just like a grapevine can't bear figs. So in all of these ways that James describes here, the tongue can pull us toward a certain path. It can destroy others, it can destroy ourselves, and it cannot be tamed apart from the law of liberty, the perfect law of liberty. Someone someone who tries to hide their double-mindedness, who says, I'm producing figs, but actually it's olives they need to be producing, they may try to hide it. They have the appearance of someone who is righteous. But as Jesus talked with the Pharisees, they have these whitewashed tombs, but inside are men's bones. That's really what's being talked about here. Poison. It's poisonous within. And I'll even make this note. There when he talks about, let's see which verse this is. Verse 7, talking about the beast, taming the beasts. Well, actually, let me go down here. Verse 9. With it we bless our God and Father, and with it we curse men who have been made in the similitude of God. So someone who says, I'll bless God, but this person over here does not deserve the same type of blessing. James says, in essence, you're still cursing God. Why? Because they are made in the similitude of God. They're made in the image of God. So you can't even get away from that aspect here. Now, for someone to say, this is just how I am, I don't have a filter, it's just my character, it's my personality, and I can't change who I am. James says you better. He says you better put a check on it. Because, again, it's going to make that religion useless. The tongue can ruin relationships. It can damage reputation. It can destroy influence. And it can destroy your relationship with God, ultimately. So James says, you have faith? Great. You're a disciple? Fantastic. Show me. Show me by the words that you use if you're a disciple. We must do this. Disciples must also have self-control with the tongue. Restraint is a must as Christians. The wisdom literature has quite a bit to say on this matter, and I'll reference just a few here. They're up here on the screen. Proverbs 13 and verse 3, whoever guards his mouth preserves his life. He who opens wide his lips comes to ruin. Psalm 141 and verse 3, set a guard, O Lord, over my mouth. Keep watch over the door of my lips. And I love that imagery where it's don't open if you think that you're going to say something out of step. Ecclesiastes chapter 5, and in verse 2, be not rash with your mouth, nor let your heart be hasty to utter a word before God, for God is in heaven, and you are on earth. Therefore let your words be few. For a dream comes with much business, and a fool's voice with many words. So again, I would note, these are all in relation, I think, to just generally the way in which we use our mouths. But we apply this again to the Word of God and to teaching. Isn't that absolutely true with the Word of God? I believe so. We also recognize that growth is going to happen over time with a Christian. Whether they are literally young in the faith, or maybe they are older in life, but they have just come to know the Lord. Even then, there's growing that might need to happen. When one becomes a Christian, it's not as if God's Spirit just descends upon them and suddenly now they can do no wrong and they don't have to put any effort in and God just takes over. No, we still have complete free will, and we have to want to serve the Lord, and we have to put in that effort over our body, over our mind, over our tongue. We have to bridle those things. The attitude must be, my life is completely in your hands, God. So whatever you tell me to do, I am dedicated to you. I am your servant. I am your subject. And you are my king. And I must serve. In talking about all these ways in which we can not have self-control, boasting, slander, gossip, profanity, euphemisms, you might think of others as well. If you're looking for something to watch, especially if you're streaming, you're just scrolling through and seeing what's out there. You may use the phrase, and I've used it, they just don't make them like they used to. And that might be even in the old days, Gunsmoke, or I Love Lucy, or Andy Griffith, Dick Van Dyke. And I've watched all those shows. And even with all of those shows, they don't have some of the things that our modern shows do, but one of the main plot devices, even in Andy Griffith, which I may like more than any of those, one of the main plot points time and again is you're going to have to lie. You're going to have to lie to make this person feel better. You're going to have to lie to get the best outcome in this, to save my own skin, whatever it might be. And then, it's a happy end to the episode. And maybe the lie isn't even found out. It's justified for that reason. So we would note, as James does, lying in whatever context is wrong. It doesn't matter for what reasons you may put forward, it's still wrong. In terms of profanity, when I was in college, I remember playing some board games with some certain individuals, and these were Christians, and a couple of times there was profanity used by these individuals. And there were those of us, the other ones of us that were there, called them out on that. Said, "Why are you using that language? You ought not be using that." And they said something along the lines of, "Oh, it's not that bad." Or as we talked about last week with clothing, but we mentioned language. Well, that word didn't used to mean that. Okay, but it does now. It is profanity, and you ought not be using it as a Christian. Even at one point in our culture, it was incredibly scandalous for a woman to use profanity. Not that anyone should be using it, but it was unheard of that a woman would be using this type of language. And now it's maybe even the women are using it more than the men because they're trying to fit in. They're trying to, work themselves up the corporate ladder to fit in with the guys, that sort of thing. I don't know. And then talking about the workplace, workplace gossip, where you're huddled around the water cooler. That's been the quote-unquote norm for some time. Unless we're living in a monastery like the monks do, we're going to encounter this kind of language. James says we are. James says that if you're in the world, you're going to encounter those things, and it may be that as you're working on the heart, as you're working to keep those things in tow, to bridle those things, to keep them in check, that you just need to just shut your mouth. You're going to have to keep working on the heart, but you just need to maybe not say as much, and that'll have to do for now as you continue to work. Restrain yourself from boasting of I, me, and my. It's always about me and what can we do for me. Restrain yourself from that. Restrain yourself from hurtful words, from slander, from insults. Of course, we know with social media, this is maybe the biggest one there is, where we're just getting on there and maybe in a passive type of way trying to slight someone. We're in the election year right now, so politics is a hot button issue. There in chapter 4 of James, we'll get to this hopefully next time. James chapter 4 and verse 11, "Do not speak evil of one another, brethren. He who speaks evil of a brother and judges his brother speaks evil of the law and judges the law. But if you judge the law, you are not a doer of the law, but a judge." So do not slander one another, otherwise you don't practice the law, but you speak evil of it. That's pretty strong language. Now I'll note there, sometimes we have to call someone out on something that they're doing, especially if it does pertain to teaching. We've got to call them onto the carpet, as it were. But even then, as Paul says, our words must be seasoned with salt, with grace. we must restrain ourselves from indecent words, profanity, euphemisms. With profanity, and we talked about this last week, those things can be clearly marked because the world even recognizes these things ought not be said. But then with euphemisms, maybe we throw those around a little more freely. And I'll just make one note on this. Are you using a euphemism, which is a stand-in for another word that means something very vulgar and profane? Are you using that word because you want to fit in, because you don't want to feel left out, because you want to be a part of the it crowd, as it were? Because maybe you don't know, but I think most do. You know what word you're using to replace this other word. So why use it? Again, everyone else knows what that's a filler for. So let's just find another word. Let's just find another. Again, we talked about Ephesians 4:29 and 5 in verse 4 last week. I won't take the time to go back to those since we're trying to get through the rest of the chapter this evening. But we noted those last time. I'll give those to you as reference. But this is the standard that we must measure our words by. As Christians, we need to use language that indicates we are of Christ, that we are disciples. And, this is a super easy thing, and it was very popular, I guess in the 90s, was it? What would Jesus do? Now, that phrase is only helpful if we know what Jesus would do. And in this case, would Jesus use that language? If not, maybe it's time to throw that away. Start using something else. Words of grace, as Paul says in Ephesians, words of grace and favor do not mean words of tolerance and acceptance. It's not what he's talking about here. It's not the language that says, you want to sleep around? Go for it. It's fine. You want to use filthy language? I love you. Jesus loves you. Doesn't matter. Go for it. You be you. You do you, brother. Jesus is the master teacher. He has the most wisdom in his speech, both in what he said and even how he said it. But the thing that I would note there is that he even offended many people. He offended many people in spite of him being very careful with how he used his words and what he said. So what I would note there is that we do not need to be seeking confrontation. We don't need to be going out of our way to get somebody's blood boiling. Even if it's true, we need to be saying it in a certain way. And we don't need to be looking for conflict. We need to be so very careful to keep our tongue in check. So with that, maybe even in your Bible, it breaks up this next section, verses 13 through 18, but I think, just like all of this has been, this is very connected to what James has already been talking about, that we are, in relation to the tongue, to use wisdom that is from above. So, if you properly bridle the tongue, what are you? You are wise. You're using wisdom. And also here, and I'm going to throw up a lot here, this will be up here for a moment, but James is moving forward. He's moving forward in his thoughts about being wise. But what we also need to note here is that he's not losing anything that he's talked about before. And these are just a few demonstrations of that. Okay, so he already mentioned there in verse 11 the idea of bitter water. And then later there in verse 14, if you have bitter envy and self-seeking in your hearts, those words being related back to verse 8, full of deadly poison. What's the opposite of that? Full of mercy and good fruits there in verse 17. And then even in relation to that about the different types of fruits that we might bear in verse 12 versus the good fruits. in verse 17. One that we've noted already in verses 9 through 12, about double-mindedness or hypocrisy. That's mentioned again there in verse 17, about the wisdom that is from above. It is without hypocrisy, the last thing he mentions there. In chapter 1 and in verse 21, we are to receive the word. How? How are we to receive the word? With meekness. With meekness and works done in meekness of wisdom, as he mentions in verse 13 of chapter 3. In chapter 1 and in verse 5 and also in verse 17, we have good gifts from above. And then here in chapter 3 and in verse 17, we have the wisdom that is from above. And that's maybe even we could say one of the gifts that's being talked about in chapter 1. In chapter 2 and in verse 18, show faith by your works. There in verse 13 again of chapter 3, let him show by good conduct that his works are done in the meekness of wisdom. And then finally, and there's several others, I didn't put all of them here on the screen. In chapter 2 and in verse 19, we have demonic faith, so faith that originates from hell. And then we have here in chapter 3 and in I said 17. Did I have that up? Yeah, I had that up on the screen as well. Verse 15, that's what I meant to say. Wisdom that is demonic. So a faith that is demonic and a wisdom that is demonic. All of these things showing us that James is not, as some people would say, like the Proverbs of the New Testament, in the fact that he's just jumping around and he's losing everything that he's talked about before. This is very connected, and I hope this at least is maybe a demonstration of that. So, continuing on here, we do have a choice, James says, of which wisdom to listen to, whether it is from below or whether it is from above. And so our choices will determine our actions. Turn over to Matthew chapter 12. Put a marker there in James. Matthew chapter 12. And let's look at verse 33. Matthew 12 and in verse 33. From the master teacher himself. Either make the tree good and its fruit good, or else make the tree bad and its fruit bad. For a tree is known by its fruit. Brood of vipers, how can you, being evil, speak good things? For out of the abundance of the heart the mouth speaks. A good man out of the good treasure of his heart brings forth good things, and an evil man out of the evil treasure brings forth evil things. But I say to you that for every idle word men may speak, they will give account of it in the day of judgment. For by your words you will be justified, and by your words you will be condemned. So what Jesus is saying here is that we should be able to tell if someone is using wisdom from above or if it's wisdom from below, based upon the words that they are using. They might try to hide it, but I think we've all had instances where if you spend enough time around a person, they're going to slip at some point, and they're going to use some type of language, whether that's profanity maybe being the most obvious thing, but any other way in which they might use it that's this wisdom from below. You'll start to figure out. Maybe it's even just hints of that. But even if not, Jesus says here that they will be judged in the last day based upon that. And it's not just them. We're talking about us. James is talking to Christians. We need to be ever so careful about the words that we use. In Philippians chapter 4, and I'll just talk about this in reference. You remember there that Paul talks about a great many things that we ought to meditate on. Really, in summation, good things. Meditate on these things. Think on these things. what we spend our time thinking about and deeply contemplating, desiring after, that's the kind of fruit that we're going to produce. Whatever we put the most effort into, that's the type of fruit that we're going to produce. And so, what do we want to be doing? It's rather obvious, I hope, at this point. We want to be taking in and ingesting wisdom from above and use it so that we go to a place that is beyond this one, that is with the one who has given us that wisdom to begin with. We go to be with God. Now, if we struggle, if any of us struggle with warding off this wisdom from beneath, it may be time to put certain plans into place. Get help, get busy on the heart, and get busy changing. Get busy changing the heart. In relation to this first thing, ask God for wisdom. Isn't that what we've already talked about, or what James has talked about in chapter 1? To ask wisdom from God, that's back in chapter 1 and verse 5. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all liberally and without reproach. He wants to give you this wisdom. Ask him for it. Seek it out. Put it into practice. So we get that wisdom by praying to God and continually looking into his word. We may even get that wisdom from talking with our own brethren. If we're asking for help from one of our brothers or sisters who maybe they have struggled with this particular problem in times past and they have overcome it by doing these certain things, get others to pray with you, to pray for you as you conquer this temptation. And after asking for help, you have to be willing to accept the help. Someone offers you a way to help in controlling your tongue, whatever that may look like. Listen to what they're saying and then work on it. Actually put it into practice. Get to a point where you want to speak what is right and not evil. Whether that is struggling with lying, profanity, gossip, slander. If you're struggling with any of those things, but you're not praying, studying, spending time with brethren, then you're not really putting in the effort that is needed in order to conquer that. It may be that you have a speech problem, but you're never going to truly conquer it until you fix the heart problem. You've got to work on the heart. And as you continue to work on the heart, you have to think about those heavenly habits that we're forming, that we need to be forming. Get a solid plan set in place for how you're going to make changes. Don't just say, yeah, it'll work itself out. I'll figure it out. I'm still serving God, and I know I'm not going to go too far over here, so I just won't worry about it. No, get a plan in place. And again, get others to help you with that. Read and pray, but again, also surround yourself with people that are going to encourage you to be using the right kind of language and to squelch that desire to do wrong. Choose your friends very wisely. And I may even offer this small piece of advice as well. Anytime or every time that you use a word that you ought not use, or say something you ought not say, have a couple of people that you trust enough to have them call you on that. Maybe they don't see you do it. Text that person and say, hey, I slipped today. I didn't do right, and I just wanted you to know, and I need you to help me. We all have those people in our lives. Use them. It doesn't have to be that specific example, but we have to have some sort of plan in place. Again, there are so many people in our culture, but throughout time, that have said, just be true to who you are, just be true to yourself, be your own person, express yourself in whatever way you want to. Again, I would note, I never find that in Scripture. Just do your own thing. Just be your own person. If we're a Christian, the only person that we want to be is our best self in Christ. We need to be the best disciple that we can be. And we can only be our best self if we are working with the help of God to change our hearts, and in so doing, to change what we say in the speech that we use. It's so, so important. And these lessons have not changed even today. Appreciate you listening this evening. You may be here this evening. Perhaps you struggle with your speech, whatever that may look like. Maybe it's something else. Maybe you have listened to that wisdom from below for some time now, and you see that its end is not worth it. As James has already said, there's another wisdom that you can choose. You can come to God, you can come to Christ this evening and put on Christ in baptism. Maybe, again, you are a Christian, but you have abandoned the wisdom from above. You've gone after something else. You can come back even this evening, and we hope that you would. And let us all reflect on these lessons as we seek to become better children of His. If you have a need this evening, won't you come as we stand and as we sing?